There comes a time in every story where silence is no longer strength, it becomes surrender. And in that moment, something within you must rise. Not because you're angry, not because you're afraid, but because you remember who you are. Now let me ask you something. What happens when a country remembers who it is? What happens when the oldest civilization on earth, a land of saints, scientists, sages, and software, finally says, enough is enough? Today, we're not talking about conflict. We're not talking about controversy. We're talking about clarity. The kind of clarity that comes after generations of quiet observation, after years of handshakes that didn't feel equal, after decades of smiling through trade terms that tilted in one direction. And then one day, India stood up, not in protest, not in rebellion, but in purpose. It said, we will no longer trade our dignity for dollars. We will no longer bargain our future for friendship. We will rise, but on our own terms. Now, before we go any further, let me be very clear. This is not a story of hate. This is not about rejecting a nation or a people. This is a story about choosing yourself. This is about a country that decided to stop being someone else's opportunity and start honoring its own destiny. Because you see, when you spent generations being told you're too chaotic, too poor, too spiritual, too complicated to lead, you start to believe that maybe your place is always second, always dependent, always waiting for approval. But India didn't forget. It didn't forget who built the concept of zero. It didn't forget the hands that launched a mission to Mars cheaper than a Hollywood movie. It didn't forget the minds that power Silicon Valley or the hearts that still teach the world compassion. So when the time came to review the trade books, India didn't just read numbers, it read between the lines. It saw a pattern, promises that were loud, but practices that were quiet, agreements that looked equal but felt anything but. And so the question wasn't, can we afford to leave? The question became, can we afford to stay? Because what good is a partnership if one side is always asked to bend, if one side is always expected to wait, if one side is always being told what it must give but rarely asked what it truly needs? India's choice to walk away from trade dependency with the world's largest economy wasn't made overnight. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was intentional. Because here's what many didn't see coming. India didn't just say no to America. It said yes to itself. Yes to fair trade. Yes to sovereignty. Yes to protecting the dreams of its farmers, its engineers, its youth. Now listen closely. This isn't the kind of decision you make when you're desperate. This is the kind of decision you make when you finally realize you don't need to be desperate anymore. India didn't slam the door. It just opened a new one. A door that leads to the global south, to Africa, to the Middle East, to Southeast Asia. A door where deals are built not just on GDP, but on mutual respect. You know, I've learned something over the years, whether you're a person or a nation, the moment you stop needing validation is the moment the world starts giving it to you. So no, this isn't about revenge. This is about revelation. This is about what happens when the scales tip, when the veil lifts, and when a sleeping giant no longer sleeps. India chose to rise, not against anyone, but for itself. And that is a bold, beautiful, and necessary thing. So today we begin a conversation, not with blame, not with bitterness, but with truth. We'll walk through what really happened. We'll talk about trade injustice, economic imbalance, and how a quiet, calculated shift is changing the global map. Because this isn't just about economics, it's about empowerment. And I want you to listen with an open heart. Not just as a spectator, but as someone who knows that choosing yourself is never an act of ego, it's an act of evolution. India didn't leave to isolate itself. India left to realign itself. And if you're willing to see beyond the headlines, beyond the sound bites, beyond the simplified stories, you'll understand exactly why. Because what looks like separation might actually be salvation. Stay with me. Because what you're about to hear is the hidden truth, the one they didn't print in the papers, and the one that's about to change everything you thought you knew about power, partnership, and purpose. Let's take a breath together and begin with a question we don't ask often enough. What does fair trade really mean when one voice is louder, one hand holds the pen, and the other is expected to simply sign? For years, we were told this was partnership. But real partnerships aren't built in echo chambers. They're built in eye contact, in mutuality, in shared risk and shared reward. Now, let me tell you something not many people know. India didn't just wake up one day and decide to walk away from trade with the United States. It watched, it waited, it adapted, and it gave chance after chance, even when the playing field kept tilting. Because sometimes, when you believe in relationships, you give more time than you should. You tolerate more imbalance than you deserve, not because you're weak, but because you hope the other side will see your patience and meet you in the middle. But what happens when they don't? What happens when decade after decade, you're still being offered scraps for your software while being charged premiums for their products? What happens when your exports are blocked with tariffs, yet their imports arrive with red carpets? That's not a trade relationship, that's a one-sided subscription. And slowly, India realized this isn't free trade, it's trade with strings. There's a deep, almost invisible burden that comes with being seen only as a market, not as a maker. And India has been both a massive market and a brilliant maker, yet too often treated as neither by those sitting at the other end of the deal. Let me break this down simply. America, the world's largest economy, has had an unspoken expectation that access to its wealth means obedience to its will. That opening your ports must also mean opening your policies. That you can sell your tea, your code, your textiles, but don't you dare question the terms of the contract. But you see, India started reading that contract more closely, line by line, clause by clause, and you know what it found? It found that equal was never actually equal, that partners was just a word used to dress up dominance. And here's the part they didn't see coming. India, quiet, methodical, spiritual India, kept the receipts. It remembered how its pharmaceuticals were undercut. It remembered how its farmers suffered under foreign seed patents. It remembered how sudden sanctions came without conversation, decisions made oceans away with no regard for local consequence. So eventually, a question began to rise, not from politicians, but from the people. Why do we keep calling this fair when it doesn't feel fair at all? And that question turned into a movement, a shift in mindset. A silent but sweeping awareness that trade is not just about goods, it's about goals. It's about whether this deal aligns with our future, not just theirs. India didn't want to fight. India wanted freedom, the freedom to decide its own economic destiny without conditions, the freedom to trade without trading away its values. That's why this moment matters, because for the first time in decades, India is not asking for a seat at someone else's table, it's building its own. And this is what I want every listener to understand. The decision to walk away wasn't rejection, it was reflection. A deep reflection on who benefits, who bends, and who always seems to be left carrying the heaviest load. When the numbers no longer add up, when the promises no longer protect, when the handshake no longer feels warm, you don't just keep walking in circles. You stop, you stand still, you look within, and you ask, who are we really serving here? That's what India did. Not out of arrogance, not out of revenge, but out of remembrance. Remembrance of its worth, its wisdom, its will to rise without permission. So no, this wasn't just a trade decision. This was a spiritual decision, a cultural one, a declaration that said, we are no longer afraid to honor ourselves, even if that means disappointing others. Because sometimes, the most powerful move you can make is the one where you stop begging to be seen and start seeing yourself. There's something that happens when you've been quiet for too long. At first, silence feels like peace. You convince yourself, if I don't make waves, maybe I'll be allowed to sail. You start negotiating your dignity just to keep the dialogue going. You lower your voice just to stay in the room. You smile through the sting, hoping one day they'll notice the bruise behind it. But let me tell you, when silence becomes your survival strategy, you are not at peace. You are at risk. For decades, India played the polite guest in a room it helped build. It signed the trade deals. It showed up at the summits. It shook the hands that didn't always offer equality, but offered opportunity. And India believed in those opportunities, because that's what visionaries do. They hope, they build, they work twice as hard for half the credit, not because they're naive, but because they see what's possible. But over time, even visionaries get tired of being underestimated. Now I want you to feel this deeply. Imagine being a country with 1.4 billion people, a country that feeds the world, powers the world, educates the world, and yet constantly being treated like a back office, a backup plan, a buyer, not a builder. Imagine contributing to global growth and still being questioned about your commitment. Imagine offering solutions and still being lectured like a student. Imagine honoring every term while watching the terms quietly shift whenever you begin to rise. That is the weight of unequal trade. It's not just about products, it's about power. It's about how one nation can corner your market, flood your economy with its goods, and then dictate your policy like it's doing you a favor. And India, patient, resilient India, took all of that in. It watched the imbalance, it swallowed the disappointment, but it never lost its memory. There were moments of hope, yes, moments where collaboration felt possible, where both countries spoke of shared values and mutual progress, but words without integrity are just noise. And eventually India had to ask, if our friendship only works when we stay small, is it really friendship? Because there's a cost to being polite in a room that quietly benefits from your obedience. There's a cost to suppressing your truth for the comfort of someone else's illusion. There's a cost to pretending that a one-sided deal is somehow strategic alignment. And India paid that cost. in livelihoods lost, in industries undermined, in voices that were never heard. But here's the miracle of truth. No matter how deeply you bury it, it will rise. And when it rises, it won't come with rage. It comes with resolve. That's what we're seeing now. India didn't end trade ties with America to hurt anyone. It ended them to heal something, to stop bleeding resources for promises that never matured, to stop being told that saying no is a betrayal, when in truth, it's an act of self-respect. India chose to honor its farmers who were being crushed under foreign agricultural giants. It chose to defend its industries, which were being outpaced not by innovation, but by interference. It chose to support its local economy, not because it's anti-global, but because it's pro-fairness. And that's the shift that scared people, not the decision itself, but the decisiveness behind it, the clarity, the calm refusal, the quiet power that comes when a nation says, we will not participate in our own exploitation anymore. And let's be honest, when you stop giving more than you get, people start calling you difficult. When you stop accepting less, they start calling you aggressive. When you speak up, they say you're breaking trust. But the truth is, the trust was broken long ago. So India, in all its courage, chose to do what few dare to do on the world stage. It chose itself. And that isn't arrogance, that's alignment, that's sovereignty, that's choosing peace over permission. Because how long can you smile through injustice? How long can you wait for fairness that never comes? Eventually you stop waiting, you stop asking, you stop shrinking, and you stand, not against, but for your people, for your potential, for your promise. India's silence has ended, and in its place, a new sound has emerged. Not the sound of conflict, but the sound of clarity. And clarity, my friends, is a force no one can ignore. There's a moment in every life and every journey when you stop asking, am I allowed? And you start declaring, I'm ready. That's the moment of transformation. And India, after decades of waiting at the periphery of power, after generations of being polite in rooms that rarely listened, finally reached that moment. It didn't happen with fireworks. It didn't come through threats or headlines. It came through clarity. Clarity that said, we no longer need permission to pursue our purpose. Because when you know who you are deeply, without apology, the world doesn't get to define your direction. And India knows who it is now. It is not a second-class player in a first-world game. It is not a passive consumer in someone else's profit story. It is not a bargaining chip on a global chessboard. It is a builder, a leader, a creator of its own destiny. This quiet revolution didn't start in the parliament or the press. It started in the hearts of the people. It started with the rural woman in a village selling handmade cloth, asking why foreign brands could undercut her with bulk imports. It started with the software developer in Bengaluru, wondering why local innovation got less funding than foreign copycats. It started with the farmer planting seeds tied to international patents, wondering where his freedom to grow went. And slowly India realized you cannot build a nation while begging others to believe in it. You have to believe first. You have to choose yourself first. That's what this decision was about. Walking away from trade dependence on the US wasn't a retreat, it was a redirection. It was a choice to build infrastructure that feeds its own people, to support entrepreneurs who didn't attend Ivy League schools, but who understand the heartbeat of this land. To invest in students who may not speak fluent English, but who dream in innovation. It was about protecting something sacred, sovereignty, because sovereignty isn't just about borders, it's about decisions. It's about who gets to say yes, who gets to say no, and who gets to define the value of what you create. India decided, we will no longer allow our growth to be managed by others' interests. It began rerouting its supply chains, diversifying trade partners, strengthening domestic industries, fueling local startups, reclaiming ownership of what it once gave away for validation. This is the hidden revolution. It's not loud, it's not vengeful, it's rooted in wisdom. Because when you've been underestimated long enough, you learn to stop speaking loudly and start moving strategically. India knew the eyes of the world were watching, and still it chose to step away, not because it didn't care, but because it finally did. It cared enough to say, we deserve more than crumbs from the richest table. We are not here to validate the system. We are here to evolve it. This wasn't anti-America. This was pro-India. And there's a difference. You can respect a nation and still refuse an unfair deal. You can admire a people and still say, this no longer serves us. That's maturity. That's dignity. That's strength. And let me tell you something. True strength never asks for applause. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't wait for headlines. It just moves forward with discipline, direction, and a deep knowing that this is right. So now the world is watching, but not for the reasons it used to. Not to offer aid, not to analyze poverty, not to write think pieces about corruption and chaos. Now they're watching to understand how a country with ancient roots and modern dreams found the courage to pivot on its own terms. And that's what makes this story so powerful. Because in a world obsessed with influence and control, India made a radical, beautiful, and deeply spiritual choice. It chose purpose over permission. It chose to lead, not follow, to build, not borrow, to trade, but not be traded. This isn't just policy. This is power, quiet, sovereign, awakened power. And once you taste that kind of freedom, you never go back. You know, there's a kind of power that doesn't come from shouting. It comes from stillness. It comes when someone who's been quiet for a long time finally speaks, not with rage, but with resolution, not with noise, but with truth. And the day India ended its long-standing trade dependency on the United States, the world didn't just hear a statement, it felt a shift. It was like the earth paused just for a second, not in fear, but in recalibration, papir for mustor, when pride. Because this wasn't the move of a victim, this was the move of a visionary. And when a country with 1.4 billion beating hearts says, we are ready to chart our own course, you listen. That moment, it was historic, but not because it broke something, because it birthed something, something new, something sovereign, something sacred. Now let me take you into that moment, because the headlines only showed a fraction of it. They called it strategic, they called it risky. Some even called it foolish, but what they missed was the most important part. It was necessary. You see, when you've spent decades watching decisions made continents away reshape the lives of your citizens, when your young entrepreneurs are held back by foreign monopolies, when your labor is used but your leadership is ignored, eventually you say no more, and that's what happened. India didn't burn a bridge, it just stopped crossing the same one that always led to the same place: dependence, delay, disappointment. So yes, the day that announcement came, that India was walking away from imbalanced trade with America, it startled some people because they were used to the old script. They were used to India needing them. They were used to India compromising. They were used to India staying in the back of the line, but something had changed. This wasn't an emotional reaction. This was a deeply spiritual realignment, a remembrance of identity, a return to roots, a reclaiming of narrative. And that's what the world didn't expect, that quiet countries can still roar, that a nation known for yoga, prayer, and patience could also stand with steel in its spine and say, we don't need to follow your script anymore. We're writing our own. And here's what I love about that moment. India didn't do it with cruelty. It didn't mock, it didn't threaten, it simply chose. And that, my friends, is the highest form of power, the power to choose self-respect over short-term gains, to choose fairness over familiarity, to choose long-term freedom over temporary approval. And something extraordinary happened in that moment. Other nations watched, not with scorn, but with curiosity. They started asking their own questions. Why are we still accepting unfair terms? Why do we keep believing we need permission to thrive? Why are we so afraid of saying no? India's decision didn't just shift its own path, it sparked a ripple across the globe, a quiet awakening among the global south, a gentle uprising of dignity, a movement of sovereignty and balance. And don't let anyone tell you that's not a revolution, because revolutions aren't always loud. They don't always come with fire. Sometimes they come with stillness, wisdom, and one clear sentence that changes everything. We are done playing small. That's what India said. And the world had no choice but to listen, because once you see a nation stand like that, with grace, clarity, and conviction, you start wondering where you've been bending in your own life, where you've been accepting less, where you've stayed too quiet for too long. India didn't just make a trade decision. It gave the world a new reference point for what quiet power looks like. It proved that growth doesn't require approval, it requires belief, that peace doesn't mean silence, it means alignment. And when you're aligned with your truth, you don't need to scream, you just speak, and the world leans in. You know what's funny about the truth? It doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives like a whisper, soft, steady, unshakable. And when India walked away from trade reliance on the United States, it wasn't just a policy move, it was a personal one. Personal for every Indian who had once felt their country had to shrink itself to be seen. Personal for every nation that had been told its worth depended on how well it complied. personal for a world that's finally beginning to understand. Real power doesn't ask for attention, it just walks in purpose, because this isn't just about India and America. This is about how we all do relationships as people, as nations, as partners. Let's be honest with ourselves. How many of us have stayed in relationships, business or personal, where we kept giving more than we received, where we were told we were valued but treated like we were replaceable, where we were called partners but only as long as we stayed small, silent, and safe? India saw through the illusion, and it had the courage to say, this version of partnership no longer aligns with who we've become. And that takes strength, because it's easy to walk away from something when you're bitter, but it takes real grace to walk away when you're clear. That's what this was, a decision made in clarity, not in conflict, a choice rooted in values, not in vengeance. And let's be real, the world didn't expect it. They didn't expect the calm, they didn't expect the control, they didn't expect the confidence. But that's what happens when a country stops asking, will they like us, and starts asking, do we like ourselves? India began answering its own questions, looking inward, listening inward, and realizing we have everything we need right here. That's what happens when you honor your potential. You stop outsourcing your power. You stop selling your silence. You stop waiting for someone else to say you're enough, because now you believe it. And this choice, this bold, historic, intentional choice, teaches something to every single one of us, that you don't need to stay connected to what no longer serves you just because the world says it's strategic. You don't have to keep participating in partnerships that cost you your peace, your progress, or your purpose. You are allowed to choose again. You are allowed to rise. So let this be a lesson, not just in economics, but in empowerment, in dignity, in standing tall in your story. India didn't break the world order. India simply remembered who it was before the world tried to define it. It remembered its legacy, it remembered its voice, and it finally gave itself permission to lead, not in someone else's shadow, but in its own light. So to every person watching this, to every soul listening, this isn't just about two countries, it's about the energy of the planet shifting from dependence to direction, from permission to purpose, from quiet compliance to quiet confidence. And when one nation stands in truth, others begin to remember their own, because courage is contagious. And sovereignty, it doesn't just belong to borders, it belongs to belief. India has spoken, not to divide, not to disrupt, but to declare we are no longer waiting to be chosen. We have chosen ourselves, and that, my friends, that changes everything. I want you to remember something before you walk out of this room or close this video. You are not here by accident. You are not broken. You are not too late. You are a becoming. Every scar, every tear, every failure, they are not signs of weakness. They are signatures of your strength. They are the proof that you kept going. So when the world tries to measure your worth with numbers, your age, your bank account, your likes, your degrees, I want you to throw that scale away, because your real value, it lies in your soul, in your courage to show up, to love harder, to speak your truth even when your voice trembles. I've stood in rooms where I felt invisible. I've heard voices that said I wasn't enough, but I kept showing up, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to myself that I was always right to believe. Believe in the whisper that tells you there's more for you. Believe in the light that flickers in you when everything feels dark. Believe in your own becoming. You are powerful. You are sacred. You are already enough. Don't wait for the world to validate what your spirit already knows. Walk in grace, stand in truth, and above all, keep rising, because the best story you'll ever tell is the one you live.